Good morning. My name's Stanley Bill. I'm the lecturer in Polish Studies at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also a fellow here at Sidney Sussex College, so I welcome you very warmly to the college on a morning that is not so warm. It's a real pleasure to see so many people here for a day that promises to be a fascinating look at what one of our speakers today has described as a vanished kingdom. Or in fact, he formally described only a part of it as that vanished kingdom, but we'll be talking today about what is generally known, rather oddly in fact in English, as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, an example of a political union that lasted for centuries, an experiment in political union, an experiment in a union of cultures, nations, languages and religions, and we'll be looking at that union from a variety of different national, cultural, religious perspectives, but also from critical perspectives. We'll be looking at the strong sides of this union, but also at the challenges that the union faced over the centuries of its existence. This state that was at one time the largest on the map of Europe. So I think an introduction is always appreciated when it's brief. So I would like to move straight on to the first panel of the morning. You can find information on the panels and the speakers in the programs that are available at the back of the room. But first of all, I would like to introduce the chair of the first panel, and I do so with great pleasure because I'm introducing my predecessor here at the University of Cambridge, George Gömöri, who's an award-winning Hungarian poet and translator, and an Emeritus Fellow of Darwin College here in Cambridge, where he taught Hungarian and Polish literature. He's published 13 books of poetry in Hungarian, 4 in English and 1 in Polish. The last English selection, which was translated with Clive Wilmer, who's also a fellow of this college in fact, was Polishing October and New Poems. With his wife Marie, he edited the verse anthology I Lived on This Earth, Hungarian Poets on the Holocaust, which was published in 2012. And his most recent book on Polish literature is The Polish Swan Triumphant, Essays on Polish and Comparative Literature from Kochanowski to Norwid. So please join me in welcoming George Gömöri.
Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for my voice, because I have got a slight cold and I'm afraid one can hear it. Well, first of all, I'd like to introduce a sociologist from Krakow, Leszek Korporowicz. In fact, he is, apart from being an associate professor, Institute of Intercultural Studies at Jagiellonian University in Poland, in Krakow. He's the director of the Jagiellonian Cultural Studies, an interesting research project, which is now at Jagiellonian University. Dr. Korporowicz published a number of books, the last of which has an interesting title, Bridges of Hope, Jagiellonian Inspirations of Intercultural Dialogue. Dr. Korporowicz.
Good morning for everybody. And first of all, I'd like to express my deepest appreciation to Stan for inviting me to such distinguished place and time and so interesting kind of studies. Just open it at the Cambridge University like Polish studies. It is absolutely great honor for me to be here and have a chance to introduce you some ideas of our Jagiellonian culture studies in this very metaphorical place, because like yesterday Stan explained me that Cambridge is a bridge on the river of Cam, That's the title of our last project in this book, Bridges of Hope, Mosty Nadziei, Jagiellonian inspiration of intercultural dialogue. And just what we really want to do, just building bridges between cultures, between nations, between persons, because contemporary world and Europe is a little bit divided, and the world is divided, and we want bridges. The metaphor of bridge is very interesting because bridge does not reduce the lines and differences of two sides of the river. Only communicate and has a chance for exchanging values, people, ideas, and goods, of course. So if we are talking in the conference about Commonwealth of Polish-Lithuanian nations, I think it's very interesting today to put a question: what we had and what we have in common, in respect to different identities, in respect to diversities. But what we have in common, that's a kind of axiological questions in modern world, very, very multicultural. And what we really need is as axiology for making something together, for what we have in common as a people, as a nations, as a states, as a universities, what we have in common, because we deeply believe that we have a lot in common, but maybe we didn't recognize all those values, and maybe that's a task for us as a teachers, as a scientists, to recognize those, the common axiological values. Commonwealth or Polish-Lithuanian is only a case. I think that good case, in spite of those differences and even conflicts and battles between those two nations in common state. But what we have in common and what we had in common, we can find for contemporary times, for contemporary challenges and contemporary educational system, for education in intercultural questions and so-called intercultural education. That's a task. Just we had a short conversation with colleagues before our meeting that when we have so many conflicts, we must to find bridges, and it's our task. At the task and challenge and responsibility just for scientists, for educators, for people who understand better. 1 week ago, I came from Australia, where our friend, Dr. Sefusdowski, the chair of Australian Multicultural Office Council, organized a big international conference entitled Social Cohesion. Social cohesion. That social cohesion does not exist without intercultural understanding. Understanding does not exist with understanding culture. Understanding culture does not exist. It is impossible with understanding heritage, our roots, our historical values. That's the reason why I, as a sociologist in our Jagiellonian culture studies, just try to explore the heritage in finding good inspirations, good practice. Because we had in history very inspiring, very fantastic common activities and common understanding, with respect, with full respect for dignity, for diversity, for dignity of persons and nations, of course. And I believe that we need such attitude today also. Respect to another people, in other nations, and at the same time find something in common. This is book, if you let me I want to get for you with congratulations and appreciation for such beautiful activity like Polish studies at Cambridge University.
Thank you.
Fantastic idea. With a hope that we can find something universal in the so-called Polish studies. Something not only for Polish and for Lithuanian people, but for European societies, maybe for Australian, maybe for in other nations and communities who want to build bridges. And let me introduce some ideas. Why bridging times, bridging values, common challenges, inspirations, and responsibility? What is interesting in historical studies, especially in this time of the so-called Commonwealth of Polish and Lithuanian, late Middle Ages and Renaissance, a lot of very interesting similarities, like interest in human nature and humanity at all. Is it interested now? Yes. We must see the humanity once again in multicultural way, intercultural relations, cultural mobility, learning of mutual coexistence, openness and cultural tolerance, synergy of local, that's interesting, synergy, local and universal aspect of cultural heritage. We had and we have some chances for recognition of such values and discovering inter-ethnic relations. So we have a lot of similarities, inspirations. That's why we have many roots of Jagiellonian's axiological thinking in objective social life, like integration, intellectual life, and social practice. That's a challenge. Pluralistic and open character of Jagiellonian values, ideas, that's also one of the rules. Long history of evolution from Middle Ages to late Renaissance, because it was free ages. And consolidating different types of values from personal, local, national, and universal level. Common goods against particular interest. It also is a challenge and root of axiological thinking, axiological roots, because, as I said, in spite of those differences, different diversities, we had a lot of common. And without axiological roots, the building of Commonwealth is impossible. Each policy, cohesion policy or multicultural policy, is impossible if we couldn't find what we have in common, what we want to have in common, and what we had in common. That's maybe idealistic, maybe, but it's our responsibility, I think, for especially in the field of education. Krakowian scholars, that's very, very unknown aspects and unknown persons, and so-called Krakowian scholars, international relations theory, with such common, absolutely common values, like dignity and respect for dignity, good faith of the parties, honest attitude, goodwill, pure intentions, and creating intercultural communication competence. So, example of such, only one person, but is absolutely fantastic even today, is Paweł Wojtkiewicz, with his theory and interpretation of law of nations as a background for contemporary cultural rights. It's very modern interpretation of cultural, of law of nations, but with respect for dignity of each nation. And what was interesting, that Wojtkiewicz discovered that the dignity is not only a value of person, individual person, but the community has also dignity. nation has a dignity. Not only one person, but a community has dignity. And we should respect the dignity of nations, of communities. As a background for serious treatment, for serious relationships, for the future. It's even universal truth. And that's why the rights of man derive from jus gentium. Jus gentium as a law of nations, as a contemporary cultural rights. What we can see, what we can find, the rights of life and its protection, very old value, and consciously written in his works, very consciously. The rights of freedom, nothing new. The rights to association, the rights of place of residence, and his a great and known polemical studies with Teutonic knights in the late middle of ages. The rights to respect of human dignity, the rights to property, the rights to just process, what Korporowicz stressed very strongly, the rights to process, to just process. The rights to protection against use of force, including convert people to Catholic, and cruelty. A lot of values very consciously and precisely described by Paweł Wojtkiewicz. That is rather unknown, even in great international universities, even in Poland. That's why, at the same time, what is interesting, the limits. Wojtkiewicz was very practical and very strictly in terms of logical thinking. He expressed only his doubts and limits of states and cultural rights. When cultural rights should be stopped. That's very provocative, maybe. But what Wojtkiewicz said, that rights, cultural rights, should be limited if it leads to destruction of rights and dignity of others. That's a border for my rights if I destroyed the human rights of others. That's a limit. The next, destruction of common goods and changing values into needs. Because needs are particular. Values are a little bit more universal. And we should not reduce universal values to our particular needs. That's only a thought, but it's difficult to express it in details, but it is general instruction, general ideas. And then last, isolation of particular groups from each other. If my rights leads to isolation, even me, I should critical think about such kind of rights. So, from this point of view, even such liberal postulate like human rights or cultural rights should be also limited if it destroys the rights of others. And what kinds of fundamental values we can distinguish in the Jagiellonian things? Very simple, three categories: human and humanity, human being and humanity, interaction and dialogue. That's a challenge. That's very universal challenge. And development and growth. Of course, a lot depends how we define all those values. But it's only inspiration. And if we see on the problem of sustainability of Jagiellonian values, we can find a balance between particularism and universalism, autotelism and instrumentalism, personalism and collectivism. And all the writers from Krakowian school just wrote about such balance. In contemporary words, in contemporary language, we can call them as a sustainability model of Jagiellonian values and express it in such a model where there are three kinds of basic fundamental values like human being and humanity, interaction and dialogue, and development and growth are connected by links where particular values are concentrated in axiology of Jagiellonian diversity. Because we can ask on the what kind of values Jagiellonian diversity could be built. Just on universalism, autotelism, and personalism, I mean dignity of particular persons and nations, and of course in balance with particularism, instrumentalism, and collectivism. And if we can say something in very synthetical way about Jagiellonian axiology of diversity, I mean that such kind of model of thinking as roots in those things and those ideas, what we have in common, could be expressed just by those universal values. And that's my hope, that in this way the Polish studies could lead something further, not only to Polish society, to Polish culture, but could be an inspiration and could be a kind of dialogue with another cultures and could have some universal aspect and universal challenges that is very, very important today in this global, challenging world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for Dr. Korporowicz's brief and interesting talk, and I found out that he's really a sociologist of history, so historical sociologist. Anyway, our next speaker is somebody with an interesting international background, because she studied in Germany, Munich, and in the United States, after which she took up a position in London at CEAS, now CEAS UCL, and from then she moved on to Aberdeen, where she's still lecturing, I think. Now, her previous research is interesting enough, the other Prussia, Poland, Prussia and Liberty, but her present research, I think, is even more interesting in the sense that she is working on Bogusław Radziwiłł, not exactly a popular character in present-day Poland, or even Poland of the past 20, 50 years, but I am very much interested in the history of the whole Radziwiłł family, so I'm looking forward to the results of that research.
Thanks very much for this introduction, and also thank you very much to you all who organized the conference, particularly Stan, for the invitation to Cambridge, which is in fact my first invitation to Cambridge. I have been quite a few times to Oxford, but not to Cambridge. That's great. I've been once here for Bassies, but that was not my invitation. So thank you very much for getting me here. Now, today I'm going to talk a little bit about something that relates to my first interests that Professor Gömöri has mentioned, Royal Prussia or Prussia and Royal Prussia within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, not only, also Ducal Prussia. But yes, I'm still with Ducal Prussia through the person of Bogusław Radziwiłł, but that's a different topic. Now, the paper is really on the Lutheran, I'm focusing on the Lutheran Reformation, and I called it A Third of Devils in Hell Already Speak German, because that's related to a quote I'm going to give you in a moment. But let me start. When in 1582 the Catholic Church adopted the Gregorian calendar, the Lutherans in Vilnius did not object. So I start with Lithuania. The Vilnian Jesuit Stanisław Grodzicki described their reaction. I quote, "I know what the heretics of the Saxon faith say. This adherence to the new calendar is a voluntary thing." It's an interesting quote, because the Lithuanian Protestants accepted the new rule as part of religious adiaphora, which is indifferent matters, not worth fighting over. The Jesuits, however, were more critical about the Protestants' irritating habit to eat meat on a Friday. The Jesuit Marcin Łaszcz wrote in 1594 to the Protestant Simon Teofil Tornowski, quote, "I certainly have cause to praise you in that you have received our dear Święty Wojciech and dear Święty Stanisław into our church, and, as I hear, have written them into your calendar, and that you have converted these saints to your faith. Poles, however, have not eaten meat on Saturday for 600 years. It has only been during the time of you Lutherans that such gluttony begun. You prefer to look into the kitchen where meat is being cooked. Not so Święty Wojciech, who fasted both Fridays and Saturdays." A Lutheran minister who had been looking into the hen house to choose his roast had, in doing so, fallen from the ladder and broken his neck. He became the topic of Catholic mockery, which accompanied him into hell, where a third of all devils already speak German. Now, these are all fantastic stories, and it was David Frick who actually found them in the Vilnian archives when he wrote his book on religious communities in early modern Vilnius. And these quotes reveal a constantly negotiated and pragmatic multicultural modus vivendi. Cultural osmosis between religions in Lithuania created what Thomas Kaufmann has called the practice of interconfessionality, accompanied by the insight that peaceful prosperity was only possible when mutual recognition of confessional difference was accepted practice. Poland-Lithuania's multi-religious state of affairs was not caused by the Lutheran Reformation. In the Union of Krewo, as you know, 1386, between the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, under the dynasty of the Jagiellonians, a multitude of religions already existed. The historian and deputy to the Polish Sejm, Świętosław Orzelski, wrote in 1592, "There is nothing new about the large number of religions in Poland. Next to the Greek religion, pagans and Jews have been known for a long time, and many other non-Roman Catholics have lived there for centuries." Not very strong in Poland, Hussite influences still fostered anti-clericalism, so typical for the early Reformation across Europe in general. While Hussitism was named the Bohemian or Czech faith, which became a pejorative word in combination with heresy, the early Lutheran Reformation was called the German religion. The earliest contacts to the Lutheran Reformation, however, did not come across the western border, but from the northeast, through Baltic Prussia, where Albrecht of Hohenzollern was the last Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights. In 1525, he adopted Luther's teaching and turned the Teutonic Order state into a secular duchy. Threatened by Rome and the Emperor, Ducal Prussia could only survive under the protection of its powerful Polish neighbour. King Sigismund I accepted Albrecht of Hohenzollern's oath of allegiance as a vassal of the Polish crown, and I'm sure you are very familiar with Matejka's famous 19th century painting of this act, the knee fall of Albrecht of Hohenzollern before Sigismund the Old. when he swore the oath of allegiance. This wider European context is important. It was not only the Orthodox who sustained Poland-Lithuania's openness to multi-religious practice. A fruitful region for the spreading of Lutheranism, of course, was the other Prussia, western part, Royal Prussia, the western part of the medieval state of the Teutonic Knights, which had rebelled against the order and accepted Polish rule by the Polish crown as early as 1454. And I've got a few maps here to just look at. Oh, sorry, that was Albrecht. Not particularly attractive portrait of him. Anyway, so here we go, the region of Royal Prussia. It's actually this bit here, which is Poland, under the Polish crown. This is Ducal Prussia. So just to locate it on the map. Now, a bit closer up, you see a little bit better. It's a funny map. That's all I could find. Yes, so the bits that are multicolored are the old Teutonic Order state, and Gdańsk, Danzig there as well. But this bit here is essentially the Duchy of Prussia that I was talking about. However, the western part, which did join the Polish crown, here we have, of course, important centers of Lutheranism. And as early as 1522, the year of Luther's first Bible translation into German, Jakob Hegge, son of a Danzig cobbler, or Gdańsk cobbler, started to preach Lutheran ideas in the Corpus Christi church near Gdańsk. Luther was aware of the success of his message in Prussia, in both parts of Prussia, and in Poland, and wrote to his friend and colleague there, Georg Spalatin, "Everywhere one wants to hear the pure word of Scripture. Everywhere one needs preachers." Immatriculation registers prove how much Wittenberg University attracted Prussians and Poles, despite the Polish king's ban on studying there. In Gdańsk, an urban protest movement against corrupt urban magistrates joined the Reformation. While the German Peasants' War raged in Swabia and Thuringia in 1525, the city governments of the Polish-Prussian cities of Gdańsk, Danzig, Torun, Thorn, and Elbląg fell and were replaced by representatives of the trade and craft guilds who adopted Lutheranism. Although the old urban elites and Catholicism were officially restored with the help of the king's troops, a compromise soon crystallized. Sigismund's anti-heresy laws were rarely, if ever, evoked, and reform ideas that originated in the parishes from the grassroots flourished in cooperation with a growing group among more influential burghers and the city councils, which eventually accepted Lutheranism. During the 1550s, Gdańsk hired German preachers to spread the Reformation, which also found resonance in neighboring Wielkopolska. In 1558, Sigismund II August guaranteed by royal edict the freedom of religion for the followers of the Augsburg Confession in Danzig, Elbing, and Thorn. Still, Lutheranism was condemned by the Polish bishops, not just and not mainly even for differences in religious doctrine, but as a force of sedition and disobedience, a threat to peace. Quote, insults against the royal and heavenly majesty, tumults and errors. Polish primate Andrzej Krzycki, in his anti-Lutheran Encomia Lutheri of 1524, warned the crown that Lutheranism led to the insolence of the vulgi. In 1560, Cardinal Hosius, Bishop of Warmia, wrote, this is from an English translation of his work, Satanism, which now rules in many parts of Germany and is gradually seeking to insinuate itself into the neighboring countries, seems to have originated in no other place than the sources flowing from the teaching first heard from Martin Luther. Hosius followed the model of Johannes Eck and his disputation with Luther, where he condemned Luther as a Hussite and a Waldensian, as a rebellious infection that threatened to spread beyond the German lands. Despite denouncing Luther as a heretic, Hosius did not care, or dare, perhaps, to take on Luther's position in a theological debate. Instead, reactions in Poland against Luther focused on the reformer's person within the orbis Wittenbergensis and not on his theology. As a result, historians have pointed out that Luther's reforms had only a very limited influence in Poland-Lithuania. Rather unspecific attacks on heretics could soon be instrumentalized, in fact, equally against the rising influence of Calvin's ideas. Poland's most vociferous Jesuit Piotr Skarga coined the phrase, "that Calvinist church or den of Lutherans." Interesting. Considering Danzig's economic power, however, it was much easier to ignore or tolerate those with diverging beliefs, as long as they did not threaten the social order. Schismatic Lutherans might have broken rules of fasting, but as long as they did not stir up revolt, they could be tolerated. A channel of communication opened up under the impact of Luther's friend and colleague Philip Melanchthon. In the second generation, many Polish Protestants followed the humanist Irenicist ideas of Melanchthon. Andrzej Frycz-Modrzewski, who during his education in Wittenberg had been a guest of Melanchthon, advised in his main opus, De Republica Emendanda, to introduce the election of ministers by the community, good education of the clergy, and the abolition of simony and celibacy rules. His goal was the unification of all Christian churches, including the Orthodox. He demanded respect for individual conscience and the benevolent treatment of religious dissenters. Even Andrzej Krycki was deeply curious about Melanchthon's humanist scholarship and started a prolonged correspondence with him, despite his early attacks on Luther's heresy. Similarly, the transfer of religious imagery and recycling of ornaments and pictorial programs between Catholic, Lutheran and Reformed print works, especially Bibles, needs more attention. Grażyna Jurkow-Laniec has recently shown how printing blocks of the first Lutheran Bibles resurfaced in Prague and Krakow in Catholic print shops. A convert from Catholicism, the Krakow printer Florian Ungler, migrated to Ducal Prussia, where he continued to print religious texts which could not be clearly identified for their confessional allegiance. In 1551-52, Janzy Klucjan produced the first Polish-language Bible based on Luther's translation of the New Testament. Its illustrations were used 5 years later in Scharfenberger's Catholic New Testament in Kraków, using printing blocks and images from the Wittenberg Bible of 1534 and the Prague Bible of 1537. The translations from Hebrew and Greek into Polish were often so bad that only the 1563 published Brest Bible, financed by the now Calvinist Radziwiłł, satisfied many Protestant demands. This reformed version, however, dispensed with illustrations altogether, except for the confessionally neutral law and grace motive, which adorns its title page. Jurkow-Laniec therefore speaks of the confessional neutrality of 16th and early 17th century biblical images, which I think is very interesting. Königsberg, meanwhile, emerged as the main center for Lutheran printing. Here, the reformer Paulus Speratus helped Luther in 1523 to put together the first German-language hymn book and maintained a lively correspondence with the Lithuanians. Lutheran print material was traded between Königsberg and Vilnius via Memel, Klaipeda, and in 1530 Duke Albrecht of Prussia first paid stipends for Lithuanian students to go to Wittenberg to study for the ministry. One of these students, Abraham Kulvensis, returned. I'm afraid I couldn't find a real picture, so I got the sculpture there from the internet, so I don't know whether that's faithful to how he looked like. But Abraham Kulvensis returned in 1539 to Vilnius and founded a Lutheran school there. His Confessio Fidei of 1543 also appeared in Königsberg, where 2 years later a catechism in the old Baltic Prussian language was printed. The only work really that has this language, which was really like Lithuanian, mainly a spoken language. In 1547, 2 years later, Martynas Mažvydas published the first printed Protestant catechism in the Lithuanian language. which, like Old Prussian, as I said, was mainly spoken among the people. So, in 1556, the Polish reformer Jan Waski returned to Poland from his exile in England and Frisia in Germany. And like Fritz Modrzewski, he desired a national church based on a union of all Protestant churches. He wrote to Hosius, "We must direct our eyes on the fundamentals of the church, where nobody calls himself Paul, Peter, or Apollo. And therefore we should not call anyone a Lutheran, Zwinglian, or Calvinist, since we all just look towards the one Christ who gave us our name as Christians." Waski unfortunately died 4 years later after his return and did not see his project triumph. Yet, in the newly formed Union State, formed in Lublin in 1569, the Dissidentes in Religione, as they called themselves, concluded the Consensus Sandomiriensis of 1570. Having decided to agree to disagree in matters of religion, in 1573 they sealed this agreement in the Warsaw Confederation. And here we have on the left the many seals that confirm that. The consensus was carried by the noble estates, where a majority signed and sealed this decision. Unlike the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, the document is on the right there, the Warsaw Confederation did not confessionally define territorial and legal boundaries, but granted individual freedom of conscience. Lithuania went further. The Third Lithuanian Statute of 1588 incorporated and enacted the text of the Warsaw Confederation into law. Toleration could therefore be claimed by way of law in the courts of the country. Although tribunals were increasingly stacked with Catholics, Protestantism in both its Lutheran and Calvinist forms grew stronger local roots in Lithuania than it did in Poland. Among the people, the borderlines between the confessions often remained fuzzy. As late as 1690, the Lutheran pastor Theodor Lepner of Budbeten in Lithuanian Prussia complained about his confessionally confused community. Quote, "It is obvious that the Lithuanians are very superstitious and still imitate very much Papist customs, as they still celebrate many Papist feast days, and they refuse to work on the saints' days of St. George and Corpus Christi. There is still a trace of Papist pilgrimages among them. They go to foreign churches on holidays, have prayers said for their livestock, and put some money on the altar for that purpose." The Lutheran minister of Gumbinen turned to the Prussian king in 1706 with a petition for a better education of future pastors who should preach in the Lithuanian language of the people and teach them catechism. Hans-Jürgen Bommelburg has recently crunched some numbers on Lutheran presence in the Commonwealth during the 17th and 18th century, when, as many Polish historians have assumed, Calvinism dominated. He found, actually, that many Lutherans during the 30 Years' War migrated from Silesia, Brandenburg, and the Neumark for economic reasons. For example, escaping coercion into the Brandenburg Prussian army and poor conditions under serfdom, and they came to Poland-Lithuania. They compensated for conversions to Catholicism, especially in the territories of Royal Prussia, Wielkopolska, and even Lithuania. In the year of the first partition of 1772, around half of the population of Royal Prussia, or 250,000, were Lutheran, around 100,000 in Wielkopolska, and that was double the number of Lutherans than they had in the 1650s. And almost 50% also of all Lithuanian Protestants belonged to the Lutheran Church of the Augsburg Confession. The older Russian German national historiography has stressed the Lutheran influences in Royal Prussia as evidence of a German character, stereotypically linking German national identity with Lutheranism, arguing the affinity of the Royal Prussian cities with German culture, and consequently, as was their argument, anti-Polish identity. Of course, Polish Jesuits mass-produced pamphlets against the German heresy, German lizards, a polemic which intensified during the Second Northern War, where the name of Lutry in some Polish manuscripts became a swear word, interchangeably used with skurwysyn. The idea that Lutheranism was associated with some kind of German Leitkultur or elite culture, however, does not hold up. Lutherans in the Commonwealth, with the exception of some Royal Prussian patricians, usually belonged among the lower social groups and not, as did many Calvinists, among the elites. Being Lutheran had little to do with being German. In the Royal Prussian cities, as Michael Müller has shown, it was the urban mob, mainly Polish-speaking, who pushed out Calvinist teachers, ministers, and other elite members among the citizenry. Polish Catholic clergy had a reason to consider Lutheranism as the religion of the unruly. We've heard that before from Sigismund. In a letter to Albrecht in 1527, Sigismund described Lutheran conspiracies in Prussia being led by plebeians crossing into Poland disguised, inciting rebellion among Polish fishwives, journeymen and sailors, as he wrote. The same attitude is reflected in the admonition by an eminent Calvinist nobleman from Ducal Prussia, sent to the Danzig Lutherans, whom he considered representatives of the lower urban populace. Called heretics and schismatics by the Catholic authorities in Poland, the Lutherans often shared this assignation with the Orthodox, and especially Muscovite Orthodoxy. Both were increasingly associated, however, with being a foreign other and an intruder of Polish unity and Catholicity, long before Jan Kazimierz' oath to the Virgin Mary at Lwów during the deluge. As a result of this enemy picture, which had intensified in the wake of the Polish-Swedish wars of the mid-17th century, Lutheran communities, whether German or Polish-speaking, became more isolated. A ban on conversion from Catholicism to non-Catholic faiths prevented internal growth, so that most Lutherans indeed came from outside by the 18th century. This explains the degree of Germanization of the Lutherans in the Commonwealth in this later part of its history. Their social marginalization led to tensions which, particularly after the events of the Torun tumult of 1724, resulted in a punitive action against the rioting Lutheran urban population and the execution of 6 Torun burghers, including Mayor Rosner. Samuel Luther Gerrit, the son of one of the burghers, banned from Torun after the events of 1724, became an early German nationalist when in the 1770s he wrote about the city as part of the old true German Prussia, as his fatherland, separated from the caked-on Polish mess and dirt. In the century of Georg Forster and Wilhelm Gottfried Herder, otherness was increasingly defined in terms of national identity, which became a new religion that no confessional fuzziness and no toleration edict could overcome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this second, also very interesting paper, which of course could be even more embellished in the sense that the Lithuanian Bible, if you remember, was promoted in England in the middle of the 17th century. 17th century, about 1650. There was a collection in England for the publication of the Lithuanian Bible, which I read about. This is very interesting. Anyway, our next speaker is Magda Teter, I suppose this is the proper pronunciation, professor of history and the Schwidler Chair of Judaic Studies at Fordham. Now, she is the author of a, I think, rather important book, The Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, published in CUP in 2005. At present, she is a Mellon Foundation Fellow at the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers in New York Public Library, completing her book on blood libels in pre-modern Europe, which I suppose will include not only Poland but other countries. So, Professor Gilbert.
I also want to join the previous speakers in thanking Stan and the organizers for inviting me here. I'm very honored to be at this really, I think, very important and very timely conference. Diasporas, especially the Jewish diaspora, have often been associated with the loss of homeland, dispersion, powerlessness, longing, exile, displacement, as well as alienation from a host land, and the formation of links between the various populations in the diaspora. In diaspora studies, the Jewish experience has been considered paradigmatic, a scattered group that has continued to long for its homeland while living elsewhere. Yet the term diaspora is not unproblematic when applied to Jews, for it raises fraught questions about the meaning of homeland, and I'll bracket, and it's also related to the theological notion of exile as punishment from God, but we won't have time to get into that. I just wanted to signal it. All these categories imply that places where diaspora people, including or maybe in particular Jews, made their homes were ultimately not their homelands, but merely hostlands. But that was not necessarily the case how Jews, including Polish Jews, perceived the places where they lived for many centuries. For Jews in early modern Poland-Lithuania, not only some of the characteristics of diasporas listed above would have rung true, while others sound hollow in light of historical evidence. Although Polish Jews indeed had a real or ceremonial relationship with Eretz Israel or land of Israel, the historic Jewish homeland, praying each Passover for the next year in Jerusalem and contributing alms to Jews in the region, Poland was nonetheless their homeland. And in Poland, Jews were intrinsic to and inseparable from the country's social, political, economic, and I would also add cultural landscape. Their distinct identity as Jews did not necessarily imply alienation, even as they still connected to Jews and Jewish communities beyond the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and even as some Christians produced vitriolic anti-Jewish works. In the early modern period, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was home to the largest Jewish community in the world. By the mid-18th century, an estimated 750,000 Jews lived there, amounting to over 5% of the total population. Yet, Jews enjoyed greater prominence than the proportion of this population would suggest. Historian Gershon Hundert has questioned the very notion that Jews in Poland at the time constituted a minority, arguing that there was no majority as we now understand the term in ethnically and culturally diverse cities and towns in Poland. Although the urban population of the Commonwealth in the early modern period comprised of only some 20% of the total, the majority of the Jewish population was urban. Moreover, the term minority, denoting vulnerability, dependence, and marginality, Hundert has argued, can only be applied to Polish-Lithuanian Jewry with elaborate qualification. Jews, thus, were not marginal, but played an important role in Polish history, inviting the question I pose in my talk: how Jewish was Polish history? The significance of understanding pre-modern Jewish life and Jewish-Christian daily interactions in Poland and in Europe more broadly lies not just in demonstrating that these interactions did take place, but rather in reminding us about the impact of political and legal transformations of state in the modern period, and what that impact, what they had on our understanding of both modern and pre-modern historical realities. 19th century scholars at the service of newly emerging national identities and ideologies offered insular frameworks of national histories, which effectively excluded Jews as foreign and thus peripheral to the national narratives, a diaspora people, if you will, and resulted in confining the history of Jews to Jewish scholars writing for Jewish audiences. This misunderstanding of European history, which also tended to see Jews as an insular minority, had ramifications beyond historiography. The absence of Jews in the emerging national histories ultimately also helped modern nationalists exclude Jews from modern European nations, and later, by extension, gave modern anti-Semites tools to justify promotion of policies that would exclude them from the social fabric of these new nations. Such omission of Jews from histories of European states resulted in historical knowledge that now needs correction. Visitors to early modern Poland often remarked on the position of the Jews as being distinctly not marginal. In 1556, Papal Nuncio Luigi Lippomano, lamenting the impossibility of implementing in Poland the bull Cum Nimis Absurdum, which had established the Roman ghetto just a year prior, observed, quote, that Jews received unbelievably many favors, and all these lords and palatines are their strong defenders. Some decades later, in 1636, another papal nuncio to Poland, Marius Filonardi, wrote to Cardinal Antonio Barberini that Jews in Poland were, quote, more powerful and richer and more favored than elsewhere. 4 years later, the same nuncio reiterated the sentiment, adding a famous Polish saying, now a veritable cliché, that Poland, quote, was paradise for Jews and hell for peasants, because these peasants are treated almost like slaves. Jews, in fact, conveyed a similar impression of their high position within Polish society. Some years after Filonardi's letter describing the cause of the after Filonardi's letter, Nathan Nada Hanover noted, a Polish Jew noted, describing the causes of the 1648 Cossack uprising in the by the Ruthenian mercenaries in the eastern territories of the Commonwealth and today's Ukraine, noted both the wretched condition of the Ruthenians and the high status of Jews. The Ruthenians, he wrote, were looked upon as lowly and inferior beings and became the slaves and handmaids of Poles and Jews. The nobles levied upon them heavy taxes, and some of the nobles tortured them heavily in order to convert them to the religion of the Pope. And they were so wretched that all people, even the lowliest among them, and he means here Jews because he then uses biblical reference to it, became their overlords. The image of Poland as a safe and prosperous home for Jews was made famous among non-Jews in Europe when Antonio Maria Graziani's biography of the 16th century papal nuncio to Poland, Giovanni Francesco Commendone, was published, first in Latin in 1669 and then numerous French editions later. Graziani conveyed to the readers how the 16th century Poland that Commendone had encountered was a place where, and he also uses Sebastian Münster's description here, but he attributes it to Commendone. One still finds a great number of Jews who are not despised like in many other places. They do not live miserably off the lowly profits of their usury and service, though they do not refuse these kinds of gain. But they have land, engage in commerce, and even apply themselves to studying literature, particularly in medicine and astrology. They possess a considerable wealth, and not only are they among the honest people, but sometimes they lead them. They have no mark that distinguishes them from Christians. They are even allowed to wear the sword and arms. Finally, they enjoy all the rights of other city dwellers, and he uses the word citoyen. Although the Cossack rebellion of 1648 and the subsequent wars of mid-17th century left the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in ruins and remained deeply ingrained in Jewish collective memory, Jews in Poland-Lithuania recovered relatively quickly. And in fact, the political and economic changes made them even more central to Polish economy than before 1648. And though some towns reported smaller populations and smaller tax bases in the second half of the 17th century, the Jewish population grew and continued to prosper, especially in Polish private towns and on the magnate estates. Jews received generous privileges, encouraging them to settle in private towns and promising, and I use words from these privileges, liberty to buy plots of land, build decent and neat houses and buildings wherever they wished and according to their taste, buy gardens and orchards, establish synagogues, and sometimes even engage in whatever trade they want. In Gnin, the Lord Jan Gniński established a separate new town for Jews to be called Nowy Gnin, New Gnin, which he promised to protect. Jews continued to be perceived as assets to the towns to the point, as Gershon Hundert has noted, in the mid-1700s, one magnate remarked that the town declined significantly when Jews married their children off to families in other towns and countries. And he tried to prevent that. He tried to keep them in his town. These privileges demonstrate explicitly that Jews were not a marginalized group. They were considered a major force in the town's prosperity, so major that they needed to be supported and protected. Indeed, Adam Teller has even argued that to understand the magnates' rise in power in the post-1648 Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one needs to understand the role Jews played in their estate. Power, Teller claims, was related to money, and the Jews helped improve the profitability of the magnates' estates and thus to increase their power. Just how much Jews were integrated into the Polish landscape and society can be seen in the geography of the Jewish domiciles in town. With few exceptions, Jews did not find themselves relegated to peripheral back streets abutting town walls. Jewish homes were centrally located, and Jews were often referred to as mieszczanin, townsman, or obywatel, a citizen. This was, for example, the case in a small town of Janowiec near Puławy, where Lord Jerzy Sebastian Lubomirski allowed Jews to build a synagogue with adjacent structures on the main square. As residents of towns and cities, Jews frequently shared the same rights and tax exemptions as their Christian neighbors, and were also expected to share resources and responsibilities with other burghers, including the use of fields, meadows, orchards, and to contribute to safety and sanitation of the towns. And when there were some exceptions, that's when the change went a little bit higher, but it was for exchange for some exemptions. A particularly telling example of the Jewish responsibility to contribute to the common defense can be seen in the 1676 Sejm decree concerning the defense of the royal city of Lwów, considered the first rampart of the kingdom against the enemies of the cross, the Tatars and the Turks. The decree specified that, and quote, that Jews, municipal and suburban, are obliged to help according to an old custom in canon defense and of the fortifications. While this obligation to defend the city was related to the Jews' right to conduct business in Lwów, the decree noted that all people, Jews and non-Jews, living in the city and its suburbs, in all jurisdictions, municipal, noble, and ecclesiastical, shared the responsibility to contribute to the city's defense. The wording of the decree is significant. Jews, so frequently referred in Christian anti-Jewish literature as the enemies of Christ and the enemies of the cross, are construed here as members of the local polity, sharing with Christians the responsibility of its defense against the enemies of the Holy Cross, the Tatars and the Turks. The Jews indeed played an integral part in the social fabric of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. To be sure, these documents identify Jews as Jews, but one also has to remember that Jews constituted not only an identifiable religious group, but also in a pre-modern society organized into distinct legal estates and corporations, a separate legal category. The Jews' integration can even be seen in the subject of Jewish autonomy, traditionally used to show the Jews' distinctiveness and separateness. But as scholars have noted over the last decades, the Council of Four Lands was inherently Polish, even, to quote Jacob Goldberg, an integral part of the state's fiscal apparatus. Known in Jewish historiography as the Va'ad Arba Aratzot, or the Council of Four Lands, it was called a Sejm Żydowski in Polish. Institutions of Jewish autonomy demonstrate that Jews were part of a complex legal and political structure of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. How much the council was part of the state structures can be evidenced not only by the name of the council and its officers, but also by its composition, which resembled the composition and order of senators at the noble Sejm, with the community of Krakow at the head, followed by Poznań and then other communities. Also at the local level, as Moshe Rosman has argued, for the Polish authorities, the Kahal, the local community, was an extension of their administration. Archival sources show the Polish authorities affirming or revoking the authority of rabbis, urging Jews to respect the existing communal structures and administrative divisions, and to obey the decisions of Jewish community leaders, or intervening at behest of Jews. Some documents indicate conflicts between private and royal Jews, pitted against each other and seeking arbitration from non-Jewish authorities. And even the presence of representatives of the Polish authorities at the meetings of the Council of Four Lands. If these documents undermine the idealized notion of Jewish autonomy, they underscore integration of Jews into the political structures of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The fact that Christian officials intervened in the appointment of community rabbis and participated in the Council of Four Lands should not be seen necessarily as an infringement on Jewish autonomy, but rather as an indication that the council and rabbis were seen as performing roles important to the proper functioning of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This rootedness and integration did not, of course, mean a utopian coexistence or lack of distinctions between Jews and Polish Christians. Although Jews and Christians often wore similar, indistinguishable clothes, shared homes and meals, and socialized in taverns, their identities were distinct. The Polish rabbi, Benjamin Slonik, was asked once if it was permissible to lend clothes to Christians who then wore them to churches on Christian holidays. The questioner's concern was not the appropriateness of lending clothes as a social practice, but rather whether by doing so Jews contributed to idolatry. Slonik allowed the practice for the sake of peace, he wrote, and noted that because Christians did not require fine clothing for worship, those who lent clothing to Christians for that purpose were not contributing to idolatry. The response testifies both to the intimacy of Jewish-Christian interactions and the similar clothes, and to the simultaneous awareness of separate identities informed by deeply ingrained sense of religious hostility. The 1726 trial of a Jew, Shmuel Dubiński, an innkeeper in Rzeszów, accused of blasphemy, exemplifies this simultaneous intimacy and hostility in a real-life drama. Shmuel sold alcohol from his house, which doubled as a tavern, and Christians came often to drink there. One day, on the feast of the Visitation of Mary Virgin, on July 2nd, a local councilman came with a friend to Shmuel's house, where they all discussed local mayoral candidates while drinking beer. The discussion then turned to a discussion about religion. I always tell students, don't talk politics and religion when you're drunk. And Shmuel, apparently drunk, said, our God is older than your Catholic one. And asked the other Christians drinking nearby, which God do you believe in? The discussion quickly escalated, leading to Shmuel's trial for blasphemy and his eventual death at the stake. What this incident at the tavern suggests is that friendly, casual Jewish-Christian interactions, which were clearly not unusual, entailed religious differences and distinct identities, and that did not always preclude conflict. There's no question that Jews were part of the social, cultural, and political context in which they lived, and as such they illuminate aspects of social, political, and cultural European history that may otherwise not be visible. Like gender and race, and subaltern studies have helped illuminate new aspects of history and culture, Jews understood through their full historical experience shed light not just on their own past or on the Jewish part of the Jewish history, but also on that of their surroundings. Indeed, in the context of Polish history, understanding the role Jews played in society, politics, economy, and culture prompts the question, how Jewish is Polish history? Thank you.
Yes, could I ask the speakers to take seats there? So we still have plenty of time for questions, and indeed I would like to kick off the questions by asking Karin Friedrich to make a comment on the role of Aryans in the Polish Reformation, which I'm afraid wasn't mentioned, although I think it's a very important part of the whole picture. As for Dr. Teter, very interesting talk, and I would like to point out that this is connected with the blood libel. Stefan Báthory's speech, or rather decree on the Torun Diet of 1576, when a Polish nobleman raised a blood libel against a local Jewish man, and the usual story about how, I don't know, Jews were mixing blood with the unleavened bread, or apparently Báthory's decree was that the death sentence should be imposed on anyone raising the blood libel against Jews. Now, this never happened, but the fact that Báthory in 1576 did raise this issue, I think is very significant. Of course, he had a great tradition from Transylvania, where he had a multi-religious state, where Arianism, Unitarianism, was accepted already at the Diet of Torda in the 17th century as one of the received religions. So I would like to, Dr. Teter, to comment on this, and in general, Báthory's religious policies.
Thanks. Okay, I think it works now. Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. Well, anti-Trinitarian or Unitarian or Arians or Socinians, there are slight differences between them, but on the whole, it's a very important group. You're right, it was certainly the anti-Trinitarians were excluded from the Warsaw Confederation. That is very important to start with. They were not part of the Protestant faiths or denominations that agreed to disagree, so they were not included in that. Anti-Trinitarianism has actually been written about quite a lot particularly still under communism in Poland. It's one of the best researched and most written about minority denominations and faiths in Poland. Exactly, right, yes. So we do know quite a lot about that. What is interesting is that the Calvinists had a very ambivalent relationship to anti-Trinitarians, both particularly the Radziwiłł family, who employed a lot of anti-Trinitarians on their estates as factors, as clients, as fortress commanders, and so on. Both Krzysztof did, Janusz did, Bogusław did. They didn't share their theological or religious views with them and didn't like anti-Trinitarianism, but they certainly feared that once the anti-Trinitarians were excluded and expelled from Poland, which of course there were officially by edict in 1658, the Calvinists would be next. So that was one of the main motivations why quite a few of them tried to protect them. Quite a lot of them said, well, why don't you convert to Calvinism, and then you can always sort of, fudge it a bit. I mean, it's that fuzziness that I referred to, that, where are the borders between those denominations? Where do we draw the line? Is there a clear doctrinary split there? Or do we protect them? And in fact, some people like Bogusław, for example, went as far as taking a whole community of anti-Trinitarians, quite prominent people, including people like Morsztyn, Ściężnik Morsztyn, or Przybkowski, Samuel Przybkowski and his brother, and several other people, out of his estates and resettling whole anti-Trinitarian communities in Ducal Prussia across the border. And supporting them also with deliveries of wood and finances and so on. So I think that it's a very interesting point here. He was true to his work, that he really wanted to protect the various Protestant faiths, even to the extent that he made himself unpopular both in Poland and Lithuania, but also in Ducal Prussia, because the Lutherans in Ducal Prussia didn't like the anti-Trinitarians a bit. So I think that's an important aspect. But apart from that, there's plenty of literature out there on anti-Trinitarianism. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. The protection, blood accusation, so the accusations that Jews kill Christian children specifically to extract blood so they can use it in the Passover matzah. Right? That's the definition. There's also the ritual murder, which is a reenaction of crucifixion. That is an earlier model. The blood libel specifically emerges in the 13th century, and the tradition to protect you in Poland, it comes only in the 16th century. It doesn't come before that. But already Polish early privileges of Jews, the earliest one by Bolesław the Pious of Kalisz in 1264, include a clause protecting Jews against such accusations. And again, it's not surprising. 1264, the first blood libel is in Fulda in Germany in 1236, and then we have papal protections coming in as well as imperial. So there is a sort of a trail of legal protection. And since then, it was part of law of protecting Jews against such accusations, including, and that's also a larger European, that slanderers should be punished if the crime is not true, with the same punishment. So again, that is the sort of a principle that we can see in other places that he's clearly drawing on, referring to. I'm not yet sure, I have to trace that, whether this is in the Polish law specifically and when it enters, but I certainly have seen it in the earlier European defenses and legal defenses of Jews. And just as a general, in terms of Batory's policies, but in terms of general, I think all Polish kings knew that they were kings of multi-ethnic, multicultural state, and that needed to be, they needed to protect them for the stability of the state. No ruler wants discord and wars and rebellion. So that is protection of Jews is part of that larger picture as well.
Questions from the floor? Raise hands.
Perhaps a dangerous question. A dangerous question.
Maybe we'll just turn that off.
Electronics doesn't like me. Possibly because I fear. I was going to ask one or two, but in fact all three speakers. How do you? Maybe a dangerous question. Well, how do you perceive today's moves in Poland towards the concept of one religion, one race nation that historians are unfortunately promulgating?
You want to start?
Dangerous questions. It's not dangerous. Poland accepted different religions, especially at the Jagiellonian time. It was very, very multicultural, multi-ethnic time, and I think that it's a good example and a good axiology for bridging state and building something together. That's a good axiological background for thinking about not only past but only about the present and future. Personally, for example, I'm personally very proud that a lot distinguished Jewish people contributed to the common state a lot, and that's as a Poles, I'm very proud of it. And like in many other representatives of different religions, like Tatars, Orthodox Christians, and that's challenge and that's educational task for contemporary young people in Poland in order to understand what the Europe is and what is Poland is. What is as a good, what is strong Poland as a Commonwealth is. And such multicultural statement, multicultural background is very deeply rooted in Polish traditions, and I think that it's worth to stress such axiology and such heritage in Poland.
Just very briefly, I think there has been a long period since the fall of communism where historiography, historians in Poland have established very firm basis to bring out, what you were mentioning, this multicultural tradition, and this has found a reflection in history books. Now, the danger is, of course, if history teaching in schools is being influenced, and I think that's the key. If that starts to change, and if there's an influence on that in sort of enforcing essentially a falsification of history or sort of a picture that does not reflect what so many historians have worked on so fruitfully over the last 20, 30 years, that is the danger. I mean, we see that to some extent in Scotland, where in primary schools, my children, for example, they were taught Scottish history for 6 years. It was very narrow, not necessarily ideological, but it was a very narrow sort of view of history. There was no British history there. It doesn't even have to be sort of even ideologically driven, but there is always a danger. I think the key is history teaching in schools.
I agree. I think that's exactly right. I do want to say a couple of things. One is that It's a very complex topic. It's related to what I signaled in my talk, the 19th century historiography and how history was written, and then 19th century discussions about ethno-nationalism, right? You had two models of nationalism that emerged. One was territorial, sort of the French model, where everybody who lived in France was a French citizen, and then one was very ethnic sense of nationalism. And that ethnic sense of nationalism also translated in how these cultures were studied. So Polish history, Polish culture was studied only by studying literature in the Polish language, not literature produced in Poland, which included works and we've seen German, Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, Ruthenian, other languages. That was not part of the curriculum. So that's one thing. Looking at the Commonwealth of the past, it was only that we were very tolerant. We Poles were so tolerant. Everybody was burning people on the stake, and we were. But there was no emphasis of that multicultural past. It was the religious tolerance, and it was used certainly in the communist era to show how, the church was backward, but we had this Polish spirit. The notion of mono-ethnic Polish state was fed in my mind, and you may disagree with it, and reinforced by the post-war era. This was the first period in over 1,000 years, if not more, where you had almost exclusively mono-ethnic, mono-religious state. The Jews were killed, Ukrainians were chopped off, Belarusians were chopped off and belonged to the Soviet Union, Lithuanians as well, Germans were expelled, Poles were stayed in that same, alone, without anybody else. And the way history was taught essentially reinforced that notion that Polish is a Polish Poland, in that sense, that is, and then as a resistance to communism, the notion of Catholic Polishness and Catholicism got merged. So it's really, to me, this period is a historical aberration, because Polish history, as we've seen, is very complex, diverse, and interesting. Scholars have estimated that in the period we were discussing, only a plurality of residents were Catholic, some 40%. So I think that I would just say.
Let's collect maybe 4 questions from the floor now, just so we get time to get through some.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentations. And I guess my question would probably partially pick up on the previous question, which is that I guess that it is probably really important for us, especially in such a context, to refine the very notion of Polishness, or Lithuanianness, and Ruthenianness as well. And basically, I guess my question would be, could you please elucidate what this notion of, Polish or Lithuanian or Ruthenian actually meant? Because we refer back to the 16th century, projecting and applying the notion, the modern notions, basically contemporary notions, projecting them on the past, which is obviously dangerous, including in terms of this mono-ethnic, mono-religious kind of understanding of history. So if you could just elucidate what it actually meant within this 16th century context.
Okay. Yes.
Just a comment at the end, not a question.
Yes.
A comment.
Okay. Well, we'll take some comments then. So, comment at the end.
Okay. I wanted to thank all 3 of you for a very wonderful morning. I couldn't follow, there was so much going on, I just couldn't follow some of what was being said. And I would very much like to see your, what you had thrown up on the wall. We might talk about that afterwards. I was bowled over by Pavel Wojtkiewicz, what he said. I couldn't believe it. I read it. something's dropped off this page. And then I thought of Mark Twain, and what you remember what he said, faith is believing something you know is not true. Fits in very nicely with what Pavel said. At least you're allowed to just unbelieve it.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I have a question about textbooks, and I guess it's mostly at Magda. So, how would we write textbooks of Polish-Lithuanian history so that history actually finally becomes more Jewish? Because the Jewish obviously participated in the social, political, and economic life of the Commonwealth, but they didn't seem to have had any. They didn't seem to hold any leadership positions on a macro-political level, I guess. So what would you do? Would you devote more space to towns? Would you focus more on economic history, more comparative history?
Thank you very much, Norman.
Yes, I'm very happy not to be the oldest person in the room for once, but also happy that such a conference is taking place, because when George and I were beginning in this field, such conferences didn't exist at all. And I've been reminded, listening to people, about the various experiences of my career many decades ago. For example, Professor Korporowicz and our speaker here mentioned Paulus Vladimiri, 15th century jurist and so on. After I published my first book in 1972, the first invitation I had from a scholar to meet him and to talk about Polish history came from the Marian Fathers in Henley-on-Thames, where Dr. Stanisław Bell was translating and publishing the full text of Paulus Vladimiri. This is the 1970s. First time I ever heard of it, but we're still spreading the word. Karin and George talked about the Aryans. Well, I didn't know much about the Aryans when I began to study the Polish Commonwealth. But I did hear some more, read about the Rakow
Academy.
Yeah, the publication, the Dimension.
Which one?
The
Publishing house. Printing house.
No, the
Rakowian?
book that the Rakow Academy produced. Is it a statement of faith?
Jagiellonian Catechism.
So I went with trepidation to the Bodleian Library in Oxford to see if they possibly had a copy of the Rakow Catechism. And believe it or not, they have 60 editions in every language you imaginable. Showing just how influential that group was, not only in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but all around Europe. They were known all the way around Europe, and
John Locke was.
Yeah, okay. But 60 editions. And I was particularly appreciative of Dr. Teter's paper and her very balanced assessment of the Jewish community. I can remember the time when I was writing God's Playground, which was something of a pioneering work. A survey, the first volume survey of Polish-Lithuanian history up to the partition. And I remember discussing with a colleague whether or not I should include a chapter on Polish Jews. And of course I decided yes, and the book had a chapter very much in the spirit of what you've been talking about. But this is more than 40 years ago. That was a sort of revolutionary idea that a chapter on Polish Jews, an integral part of the history. Just as there's a passage about the Germans in Poland and German culture from the Polish lands, and I remember feeling extraordinarily isolated in all these ways. And here there are young people discussing it all with great erudition, and I'm extremely pleased and relieved to listen to you.
Thank you. One more question, if Christina Sadowska.
My question will be for Professor Magda Teter. You've mentioned the execution at the stake, and it directly relates to my paper on. One of the Jewish executions on the religious grounds of common in your experience, in your research. How many of them came up?
Okay, so we've more or less run out of time, so I will ask you to be as brief, as concise as you can whilst answering the great questions that we've had.
Okay. The Polish identity thing and the Lithuanian, and it's very interesting that inside Poland, and people can chime in, the identity of Polish was the noble identity. But outside, so I've been sitting in the last 2 months and reading European early modern chronicles, Munster and Cosmographia and all these, they talk about Polonos, Lithuanians, Russos, so they assign certain ethnic, proto-ethnic kind of identity. So it's quite complex. Textbooks. I think historians shouldn't see a document with Jews, oh, this is about Jews, and not read it. So you can integrate it in terms of if you're studying novels, and you're studying their estates, what Adam Teller did, or Moshe Rosman did. It's a book about the Radziwiłłs or the Czartoryskis. It happens to be about Jews because Jews play such an important role. So if you look at culture, if you look at the economy, you can certainly see it. Politics, yeah, they may not have been in the leadership, but when you look at politics as part of sort of taxation administrative system, then Jews become part of the story. So that's how I would Professor Davis's book was revolutionary in that way, but now I think we have enough knowledge that we can not just have a chapter about Jews, separate chapter, but have them weave in through the story as it is told. And there was the last one about the stakes. My book, Sinners on Trial, which came out a few years ago, deals with this whole notion of executions at stake. And they were not just Jews who were executed. It was a religious crimes were executable at the stake, and both Christians and Jews were part of that. We can have that conversation later on.
Very briefly, also about the national identities. I've written a whole book about the Prussians. Of course, you don't find anyone going abroad and saying Germanus, that doesn't happen. But they said Prutenus. So they actually, the people from Royal Prussia did identify themselves as Prussians. Or Radziwiłł, who goes abroad to France, he says Lituanus. So you do get that. So I just want to confirm what Magda said. Absolutely, it's very complex, but certainly the sort of main nations of the Commonwealth, they did identify themselves as such when they were abroad. You're right, yes. Very briefly, what Norman said, this spreading of the anti-Trinitarian treatises, like the Calvinists, there were international networks, and that is the big difference to the Lutherans. The Lutherans do not have these networks. They have the link to being the Saxon faith and to Wittenberg and to, sometimes people come from Germany to be preachers there, but they do not have the international dimension, and they do not spread their, also quite, the linguistic limitations when they publish. They publish in German. And it's not, or in Polish, of course, but it's not this international network that we have in Orléans and in Leiden and in London and so on, in Heidelberg and so on and so on. And Trinitarians very much had these networks, the Calvinists, of course, even more.
Yes, that's what is important. The future is important. That's why education and the history and our consciousness, national, ethnical, religious consciousness, is important. But multicultural world today demands something more. More, I mean, intercultural competence, dialogue, understanding, and common responsibility. That's Jagiellonian values. That's why I believe that such tolerant values like what Korporowicz just wrote as absolutely pioneer in the law of nation is very good axiological background for educating young students, young people with a sense of responsibility for the common future on a base of very different values in different nations with respect to the dignity of each nations. And that's attitude, that's education, that's upbringing of our young persons in our universities, schools, and so on. So that's the greatest challenge, to think about the future on the basis of common respect, appreciation for common history, and finding such good practices and good values on the basis we can build such bridging of hopes.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful start to the day. Could you join me once again in thanking George Gömöri for chairing the panel? And then a very warm thanks to our three speakers of the morning.